In this project, I'm going to show you how to build a download progress bar with JavaScript, right from a blank page all the way to receiving progress events, updating a custom download element, and then finally saving the file. And the main purpose is to teach you more about JavaScript promises in a practical way. Because if you're a bit like me, you can relate more to actual examples rather than just theory. So let's start our download progress bar project right now. So we're going to approach this project in several different sections. We're first of all going to work on the JavaScript to actually get the progress events from the download, and then we'll work on displaying those in the console before we move on to actually update the UI elements and add some styling to them. And then finally we'll wrap it all up with some error handling and also some final functions that actually trigger the download in the browser as well. So let's get started straight away writing our JavaScript. So the first thing we need to have is a file to download. So I'm going to create a variable and I'll just call it file to download. And this is just going to be a reference to a file that's actually inside of the project directory. So I've just created this zip file, this big file.zip, which is about 10 megabytes, but you can use any file that you like for the project. If you are following along with the code online, then this file will be available for you in the project repository. So that's simply a reference to the file name that we're going to be downloading. So another thing that we need to do to get started is just to have a reference to a button on the page to actually trigger the download, because we don't want this download to be triggered each time we refresh the page here in Live Server. So just over in our index.html, I'm just going to create a button. So we'll say a button, and I'll just give it an ID of start download, and we'll just put the text in there of download, so we can see that button appearing on the page. And then in our JavaScript, we'll just get a reference to the button. So we'll say start download element is equal to document.getElementById, and we had the ID of start download. So let's get set up straight away with the event listener for that. So we'll say start download element dot add event listener. You're probably familiar with this syntax from previous tutorials. So whenever we click on the button, let's just test that's working. We'll say console.log download started. And now when we click the button in the browser here, we can see in the console that we've got that text displaying. So that's all hooked up and we've got the right reference to the element as well. So can you guess how we're going to actually download this file? Well, if you've used the fetch API before, you might have used it to retrieve JSON data from an API. So we're going to use the fetch API again this time, but instead of getting JSON data, we're actually going to get the chunks of data from progress events that come back from the fetch request and use that data to keep track of what's been downloaded and then update our UI to show the overall progress. So that might look a little bit something like this. So we're going to say we want to fetch, and we're just going to put a / on the fetch request, just because it's actually a URL for the file that we're going to be downloading. So we'll use that file to download reference up here, and then this will create a URL for fetch to actually go and request that file. So the fetch API, the call to this fetch function, actually returns a promise. And when a lot of developers are asked to explain promises, they simply say something along the lines of, it's a promise to do something, it's a promise that I will do something later on, which is absolutely fine, it's totally correct. But a lot of people have problems relating that to code within their projects. So for example, the fetch API here is returning us a promise, and it's a promise that at some point it will actually download this file, but there are lots of things that can happen in between. And in our case, the things in between are going to be the progress events that we want to capture and then update the UI with. So with the promise in JavaScript, we have different properties that we can access on it. The first is going to be the then property, which is what happened next after the fetch API call has been initiated. And then we can also catch any errors. So if something goes wrong with anything inside of this promise, then the function that this catch property will hold will be invoked. And we've also got a finally property as well, so we can use this to run some code when the promise is completed, even if there's been an error. So we're going to see how each of these different properties and the functions that we can provide inside them will work as we go through filling out our download progress bar. Okay, so let's go inside of our then block to start off with. So we're going to create a function inside of here, and that function will receive a response argument. And if you've used fetch in previous projects before, you're probably going to go right for response.json, which will then get the JSON data from this particular URL. But of course, we're not working with JSON data in this tutorial. So instead, we're going to do something different. We're actually going to get a stream reader to actually read the data that's being passed from the HTTP request. So we can do that by setting up a new variable called reader, and then on the response.body there is a function called getReader. So we'll save the result of that into the reader variable. And then we need to work out how much data we've actually downloaded and how much data there is to download. So I'm going to set up two variables for that. The first, for the total data, we'll say a variable called total size, is equal to the response.headers.get content length. So the content length is a header that's available on most requests, which indicates how much data there is to download. And there is a little bit of a caveat here because some services might not even set the content length header. And also if you're using any compression on the server side as well, such as gzip, this won't give you a totally accurate result in terms of how much data is to download. But dealing with these problems is a little bit out of scope of this tutorial. And for our purposes, we're not going to be using any of those things. So this should work totally fine. The only thing we do want to do is just make sure that this is a number. So I'm just going to wrap this in a number boxing object here so that we've got the total size as a number stored in that variable. And the other thing we need to have as well is the total size downloaded, we say, and we're just going to set that to 0 initially because we haven't downloaded anything as soon as that download button has been pressed. So there's a function on this reader object that we've got here called read, which actually returns a promise as well. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in just a second. But what we're going to do inside of this then block here is create another function which we can call multiple times to read the data. And the reason I'm creating it inside of this then block is because we want to make use of some of these variables, such as the reader and the total size and total size downloaded variables that we've just created. So creating the function inside of here will just keep them in scope. So let's create a function called read data. I'm actually going to return from this function a call to reader read. This is the function from the reader object that reads data from the actual network request. And as mentioned, this actually returns a promise itself, so we can then access its then property from here. So once that read function has read the data from the stream that we're working with, we then get a result, and that result will have two properties on there. It'll have result.done to let us know if there's no more data to read, but also result.value, which will be the chunk of data that's just been read from the stream that we're working with. So what we want to do from here is check if result has a value property, and this will be falsy. There won't be anything there when result.done is true. So we need to check that this is actually truthy. What we're actually going to do is say the total size downloaded is equal to the same value that it was before, but we're actually going to add on result.value.length because this value here is actually an array of data that's been retrieved from the HTTP stream as the progress is updating. So once we've updated this total size downloaded variable with the data that's been retrieved from this particular progress event, then we can work out a percentage of what's actually been downloaded because we know the total size that's been referenced up here. So the percentage here, we'll just create a new variable called percentage, and we'll call math.floor, and it's basically the result of the total downloaded size, total size downloaded, divided by the total size overall. And we just multiply that by 100 to get it into a percentage. But what we should have now in this percentage variable is a value that represents how much of the file has actually been downloaded. Okay, so we can log that to the console just to check that that's all working. So we'll just create a template literal here. We'll say the total size downloaded out of the total size, just to keep track of the data that's been downloaded in the console there. And then just in some parentheses here, we'll just log out the percentage as well so we can keep track of that too. Okay, so if we just save the page and then if we just make a call to this read data function, because this returns a promise, I'm actually going to return it from this then block as well, which you'll see why a bit later on. But if we just make a call to that read data function, which is just defined here that we just created a second ago, if we now go over and click the download button, what we should find is that we've got the download started message, and we've also got this first chunk of data being displayed in the browser here, and that was 18% that was downloaded. Let's put a percent sign in there just so we can see what that actually means. Try it again. There you go, you can see it downloaded 6% in the first progress event that was called by this read data function, but we want to keep reading data and getting those progress events until there's basically no more data to read. So how do we call that read data function several times? We can use a while loop because we don't know when the end result will be, but you can run into problems when using loops with promises, and one way to avoid that is to use the async and await keywords, but we're not going to be doing that in this tutorial. but I will leave a link to how that works in the description below if you're interested. But all we really need to do inside of this readData function, where we're returning another promise, is to basically return another promise if there is still more data to read. So we're kind of chaining on or linking these promises together, so they'll kind of keep running until there's no more data. And we can do that by simply saying if the result that we got from this first promise up here, if the property on there of done is faulty, if it's not done, then all we're going to do is return a call to the readData function again. So this will start another promise, and as mentioned, it will kind of tack it on to the existing promise here. So we'll just create a chain that will keep running until we get to the point where there's no more data, and then this promise will actually finish. So if we click the download button again now, this readData function should keep running and keep creating more promises until we get to 100%. So if we click that now, you can see that we've got all of these progress events that have come through, and you can see that we've got to 100%. So all the chunks of the data have now been read. And if that was a little bit quick for you, we can actually slow that down in our Chrome DevTools by going to the Network tab and then clicking on a slower network connection. For example, we'll go fast 3G. And if we just clear the console and click that again, you should find that the progress events are coming through a lot slower now because we're downloading that 10 megabyte file over a fast 3G connection, but obviously it's taking a little bit longer than it would have done on my Wi-Fi. Okay, so this seems like a good point to go into our markup and create the download progress bar, and then we can work on styling it and then actually updating based on these progress events that we've got coming through here. So let's first of all go to our index.html file. And we don't need a lot in here, but what we're going to do, just after we've created our button, we're going to create a div, and that has basically got a class of download progress bar. And we'll give that a suffix of container. So this is just going to be a containing element, which we'll set at a specific width. And then the element that's going to be inside that is going to be the actual progress that you can actually see, that we'll update with our progress events. So we'll have another element inside there, just another div, and we'll say it's progress bar, and this time it's suffixed with progress, and just close off that div. Okay, and that's all the markup that we need. We won't obviously see anything on the page at the moment, so let's go and add some styling for that. So to add our styles, we'll go over to our app.css file, and the first thing I'm going to do, just to get this to appear in the center of the page, I'm going to set our HTML to 100%. So that's the tag at the top of our document, and then the height for our body is also going to be 100%, and then we're going to set the display of the contents inside here to be flex, and we'll have the flex direction to be column, so everything's stacked on top of each other. And for some alignment, we'll say everything, the items are centered, but also the content is centered too. And you should find that button now appears in the middle of the page. And we want to keep the console open just to see the progress events coming through, but I'm just going to minimize it a bit so you can see the main elements on the page that will actually give us our download progress bar. So let's set a few other things on the body. The font family, you can choose whatever you like here. I'm just going to go with the Verdana font family, and all of the relevant fallbacks as well. And the other thing is we've got a background image that we can use just to make our page a little bit more interesting. So for our background, it's going to be a URL, and in the actual repository, if you're following along, there's a bg.png file. But again, feel free to use whatever you like for your project. So bg.png. There you go, we should be able to see our download progress bar appearing on that background. So before we actually do the download progress bar, let's have a look at the download button. So for that button, I'm just going to set a background color, and you can choose whatever you like for that. I think it had sort of a greenish color, kind of pastely sort of color, but obviously choose whatever you like from there. And also the color for the text was kind of white. Again, customize this how you like, so save that. And the other thing we want to do is set the font size to be 20 pixels, font weight to be bold, border to be 0, and also padding as well. So we're not going to worry too much about the aesthetics of the download button, but just give us something to work with from there. Okay, so let's start working on the download progress bar itself. So we'll say download progress bar underscore container is the first thing. So we're going to set some a specific width on this. So we've got something for the actual progress element inside there to kind of fill it up. So you You can choose anything that you like here, but for our purposes 400 pixels will be good. We'll set an explicit height of 40 pixels, and we'll also set a background color on there. We'll have something black, so it's kind of not filled in, but we'll just select something a bit more grey, just so it's not solidly black there, but that should do us for now. And this is up to you if you want to do it or not. In the example we had at the start, the border radius we've got the curved edges on there, but so you can have that kind of effect if you want, or leave it square, up to you. And also I'm going to add quite a large box shadow on here, just so that it's got some background to it. So 0, 0, 64 pixels, 64 pixels, and we'll use an RGBA value, and it'll basically be white, so 255, 255, 255, and then 0.15. And it kind of gives us that glow behind the progress bar. So that gives us our container. So this is the containing element, and then the progress element is just going to move across here. But we need to put some styles in for that as well. So it needs to be a specific color, for example. So let's create some styles for that. So we've got the download progress bar container, but also for the progress element as well. And what I'm going to do for here, instead of just setting a specific background color, I'm going to use a linear gradient, and it's going to be going towards the right there. And for this, I've got some specific values that I used before, because it goes from a sort of dark green to a lighter green and yellow. So it's 51, 139, 147. We've got that kind of pastely type green color. And then the second value that we're going to is going to be 182, 244, 146, which you can see is a lot lighter green. So as this progress element moves across, the gradient will become a bit more pronounced, and it will just give us that nice effect as the actual progress bar goes across the container. So let's match the border radius as well. So we'll say border radius is 20 pixels. And we're going to put some text inside of this as well for the actual percentage of completion. So we'll start with a sort of white color, and then we'll just change it to a bit of an off-white color there. So let's set the font weight again to be 900. And again, we're going to use a display of flex here. So this is an interesting one because we're going to put the text which represents the percentage of download actually inside of this progress element. So it's going to kind of follow it along as the progress element grows, but you might want to stick it exactly in the center of the container element. So if you did want to do that, then this isn't the approach for you. But this just keeps things nice and simple and keeps us focused on the JavaScript code and the promises rather than actually any design work. So we'll just set the text content inside there to be aligned nice and centrally. And we're going to set the width of this to be equal to 0 because we don't want anything to display when there's no progress. So we'll just set it initially as 0. And then the height will be 100% of the container element. So that is all the styles that we need for our download progress bar, and you can see we've just used simple divs, and the reason for that rather than using something like canvases, because when I was putting this together I was thinking what is the simplest way that we can create a progress bar, and all we're going to do now is with that width of the progress element is just going to move that or increase it based on the percentage that we calculated in our JavaScript a moment ago. So let's head on over there and go back to the app.js, and we've already got the percentage that we worked out in our previous line of code here. So all we need to do is grab a reference to the actual progress element inside of here in our code and then make some changes in this if statement when we've got a value inside of our progress event, which is inside of result here. Okay, so let's just go up to the top of our code here and we'll just grab a reference to the progress element. So we'll say download progress element is equal to document, and we gave it a class, so we'll say query selector. And it's the class that we set up here for this progress element. So let's just copy it so we don't make any mistakes. Go back to our JavaScript and paste that in there. So this download progress element variable now has a reference to the element that's inside of the container. So now when we're inside of this if statement, as I say, we know the percentage already. So what we can do is we can say the download progress element dot style dot width is equal to basically the percentage, but we also need to include the character percent inside of this width assignment. So we'll use a template literal here and use the variable of percentage that we've created, and then actually put the percentage sign on the end of it. And so now each time one of these progress events come through, as we saw in the console before, we'll now update the width of the progress element inside of the container, which should then move across until we get to 100%. So let's save that and actually test it out. So if we click the download button again, you can see here that that progress element is being updated. The width is being updated on each progress event, which matches what we can see in the console. So it just creeps across the page. So there you go, there's our download progress bar set up and working, but there's loads more we can do with it. So let's actually first of all create the text inside of the progress bar as well. So that download progress element again, we're just going to set the text content inside of there to be equal to same sort of template literal. So a percentage and a percentage sign. And if you save that and try it again and click download, and you should find that we get the numbers updating with the progress events as they're coming in, which is exactly mirroring again what we've got displaying in the console, just to show you that they're all lining up. So I said at the start of the tutorial that the point here was to learn about promises, and hopefully we've learned here about how the promise chain works to start us off. But one thing we can do actually once the read data promise has completed, because this is just returning a really long promise, we can actually then access another then property so that when the download is completed, we can actually trigger the download. So for example, I can just say then straight after this other then, and just as an example, I can say log into the console that the download is finished. So we can try that out. You can probably guess what's going to happen here, but essentially when the download is finished, we should then move on to this part of the promise chain, and it should run this code that's inside of the function that we've provided to this then block here. And as you can see in the console, we get that download finished, which isn't really very useful. We actually want to trigger the download because although we've got all of these progress events coming through, we haven't actually captured the data from those events, and we've got nothing to download. You'd expect Chrome to show the file to download here. So what we're going to do for that is actually keep track of all of the values that are inside of this read data function, and then we'll just create an element on the page which actually triggers the download. So that's what we're going to do now. So the first step in this is just to keep track of the data. I'm going to create an array called data chunks, because for each chunk of data, we're actually going to save that in this array. And inside of the read data function, this result.value is actually one of those data chunks. I mentioned earlier on that the value is actually an array, and we're going to save that inside of our data chunks array. So we'll say data chunks.push and then the result.value. So by the end of this read data promise chain, when that's finished, the data chunk should hold all of the data that's been retrieved from all of the progress events. So because we defined that variable up here in the event listener, it should be available to us in this other then block here. So what we're going to do is actually take those data chunks and append them onto an actual element on the page, and then actually simulate a click with JavaScript, which will in turn actually download the file for us. So it seems like a bit of a weird thing to do, but we're actually going to take the data that we've got from the progress events and trigger a download using that. So inside here, I'm just going to create a new element, and it's going to be an anchor element actually. So we're going to say document.create element, and the type is going to be an anchor, so a link. And then with those data chunks, we're actually going to create something called a blob, which is basically a binary large object, and it's something we can use to append onto the actual anchor, which triggers the actual download for us. So in here in our JavaScript, we'll just say the blob is equal to a new blob, and what we're going to pass into that, well, we need those data chunks that we got from the previous step. So that will actually be the file itself stored in a variable. So from that, we can say the download anchor.href is equal to URL, create object URL, and then we'll pass in that blob that we've created. So if you can imagine if we were adding an anchor tag onto the page in our HTML, the actual href, the actual place where that's going to redirect users to, is basically going to be the file that we just created. So we want to make sure our file name has got a specific name. So for the download anchor, we set the download property of that equal to the file to download, which is the global variable that we set right at the top of the file here. So that'll be bigfile.zip in this example. And we want to get that anchor tag onto the actual page. So we'll say document.body.append child. It doesn't really matter where it goes because we're not actually going to have it there for very long and it won't actually be visible. So for the download anchor, once it's on the page, we can actually trigger a click event from it. So this is the same as a user actually seeing a visible link on the page and clicking it. And then once we've done that, we'll say document.body.removeChild, because we don't want it hanging around after the download's complete. And we'll remove that download anchor element. So let's click the download button one more time there, and you can see the file hasn't downloaded yet because we've not reached this point in the promise chain. But as soon as the read data functions and the promise chain that's involved in that has finished, and when we get to 100%, you can see we've actually triggered the download of the zip file, and that's because we've reached this point of the promise chain, and the code that's inside of this then block has now run. And as you may have guessed, we've actually created that element on the page, clicked it, and it's triggered the file to download. So that's just one way that we can trigger a download once our progress events have completed. But the point here is that you can actually keep going with the promise chain as long as you've got something that returns another promise, which the read data function does. The code will actually wait until that's finished before we actually start doing anything else. But what about if we actually encounter any errors? For example, what if network connections dropped or something? We wouldn't actually be able to get those progress events and do the download. And that's where this catch block comes in. We can actually catch an error here and do something different if there is a problem. So I'm going to show you how you can use this catch block now to create some custom behavior if there is actually a problem with the download. So the catch block will just take another function, same as the then block does as well. And there's going to be two things I'm going to do here. First of all, with the download progress element, I'm actually going to set the text content of that equal to be download error, just to let the user know that there's a problem with the download. And the other thing I'm going to do with the download progress element is to actually add another class on there just to change the color of that. So we'll say the class list on there. We'll add a class of error. Just get rid of this as well here. And of course, we didn't create that class when we set up our CSS, so let's go and add that down here. So download progress bar progress. If we get the error class on that element as well, we'll be lazy here. We'll just set the background color to be red. So if we just go back and try the download button again, you should find that that works still as expected. And when we get to 100%, it should download the file again. But we can simulate a problem with our network if we go over to our network tab again. So we're currently working on a fast 3G connection, but we could set that to be offline so that we've got no internet connection. And then when we click download, you can see the text is now changed to download error, and that's because the code inside of this catch block has actually executed, and it doesn't seem to have added the class on there correctly. Maybe we made a mistake. We seem to have the right class name in there, and okay, so we're setting background color. Okay, so on the progress element, we're setting the background property to be this linear gradient, which I think will probably override that. So we'll just need to. That'll probably be why it's not showing us the red color, because the other background property is taking precedence. So let's just saw it flash up there. Let's just refresh the page. So we've got download here, which was 100%. And going back to an offline state, if we hit download, yep, so we've got the text, and the background color is being set to red as well. But yeah, the purpose here really wasn't to show you the styling. It was more to show you that you can catch those kind of problems that are appearing anywhere within your promise chain, and then obviously have some custom behavior when those occur. So what about the finally block as well? Can we do anything with that? Well, yes, we could. There's a few problems that we could encounter with this download button. And if we're actually clicking the download button multiple times, we'd actually get some problems, because it will actually trigger multiple click events to go off and actually download this file multiple times. And I've tried this, it did actually crash my browser when I did it, so I'm not going to try it in the demo today. But what we could do is actually disable this button when the click event is fired, and then in the finally block, when everything's done, whether there's an error or not, we can actually re-enable the button. So that's pretty simple. We can just go up here into the start of the click event, and then for the start download element, I'm just going to set an attribute when the download is started, and that is for disabled to be true. So again, we'll just add a style in for that, so just so that we can see it actually happening. So for our start download button, we'll say start download and target the disabled state, and we'll just set the background color to to be the same, but we'll just make it a bit darker, just so it looks like you can't click it again, which you won't be able to. So let's try that out. So when we click download, you can see that the download button's gone into that disable state. We can't click it anymore, and the existing download request is going to enable to be will allow that to complete. So that will go to 100% and download the file. But of course, the button is still disabled. So if you wanted to download it again or re-trigger that for some reason, you can't do that. So what we need to do is in our finally block down here. So this runs when the actual promise chain is completely finished, and this will run even if there is an error as well. So we want to re-enable the button in either case, because even if there's a problem, you might want to try it again. So for that start download element, we'll just remove the attribute of disabled and just save that. And so now if we try it one more time, the download should go ahead. And again, it's disabled, we can't click it. But when we do reach 100%, we'll hit this finally block here within our promise chain, and we should find that the button is now re-enabled, ready for us to click it again to restart the download if we need to. So that hopefully explains what you would use the finally block for. It can be used either when the promise is completed, even if there's an error, and that code will always run. So as you can see, you can use these promise chains to sequence events and actually catch errors when they occur. But because everything needs to be separated out into the chain, so you've got the then, catch and finally blocks, it can become a little bit messy, especially when you've got lots and lots of things that you need to do within a particular chain. And if that becomes a bit of a problem for you, then you'll need to understand the async and await keywords. So check out this next tutorial where we'll be building a project that will use the async and await keywords to simplify a complicated promise chain and to ultimately make your life a little bit easier. But that's it for this tutorial. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.